In horror-themed gaming, atmosphere tends to be key. Unconstrained by setting, style, or storytelling technique, a game's entire feel, if it were, can be greatly changed solely from targeting a different atmosphere. While difficult to put into words due to its very nature, I think most people would agree that the developer of Dark Souls and Elden Ring nails a darker, horror-esque atmosphere. Maybe it's partly why it blew up when it did. In the midst of other action-heavy titles, Dark Souls hits the senses differently than its contemporaries. Despite its atmosphere and gameplay not sounding complementary exactly, FromSoftware managed to also push boundaries with its challenging, skill-heavy combat, so much so it's essentially become a staple for the studio. Though gameplay is likely what the recent games are best known for, their dreary atmosphere and cryptic storytelling was fostered far earlier in the company's history, all the way back to their early days.
No. Please, don't open that door.
Originally creating accounting software after their founding in 1986, the only 3 employees at the time enjoyed playing a series called Wizardry. Though speculation, these games may have influenced their more recent games' more bleak and enigmatic qualities. Kingsfield would be the team's first notable release in 1995 and contained similar attributes to Wizardry. Staff would raise to 7 employees for the game, and they chose to release it for PlayStation as they thought it would be better suited for rendering polygons. This first-person RPG tasks players with navigating dungeons and combating enemies to progress. It was also a technical rarity for 1994 as most games at the time had many 2D elements, yet Kingsfield was fully rendered in real-time 3D. Selling about twice as anticipated, successors and new IPs were next, so they split into multiple teams and added a myriad of employees. 2 more Kingsfield titles, 2 new mech shooters in a new series called Armored Core, and a different RPG called Shadow Tower would release from 1995 to 1998. Despite their rapid pace, FromSoft would bestow one more game to players in 1998, having similarities to their previous games, especially Shadow Tower. Yet containing no combat, this bold entry would be largely unseen in the industry and FromSoft's catalog. However, this doesn't mean there's nothing to be found, so here's a journey to discover what a little-known game from 1998 has to offer. Echo Knight. Quickly guiding you through the early experiences, main character Richard receives a key from his father, Henry Osmond. It's soon discovered that Henry's house burnt down, so Richard is brought to it as his father hasn't shown up. It's here we find our first sample into gameplay, where multiple interesting elements present themselves. The first intriguing aspect, commonplace now, can be found in its physical spaces. In developing their Kingsfield games, the team introduced some realistic environments as well as basic objects like houses and desks. Wanting to take realism even further, they made a world specifically to include more granular details, giving desks drawers, then giving those drawers keyholes. In fact, this experimentation was initially just that, a test. The team later decided to make it this game. The second notable feature found off the bat, and far more rare in gaming, can be found in the player being able to interact with nearly all objects in some manner or another, not just key ones. While other games have objects that the player can interact with once and that becomes its sole function, Echo Knight's environments allow for a greater level of engagement. Certainly not all objects provide a usefully engaging experience, as many of them are simply descriptions. But this amount of interactivity can lend to the sense of being inside an active world, whether you as a player are engaged with it or not. After finding a book, you're sent back in time to a different location. A train. This is another interesting quirk of Echo Knight not often seen elsewhere. In other games, relevant lore is typically expressed via logs, often audio or text. Actual flashback sequences are used in Echo Knight, and while this could be jarring to go from place to place and character to character, may also add to a greater understanding of the story in a more engaging way than what logs can provide. In the story, we discover an old man, William Rockwell, holding his own granddaughter hostage to ensure his pursuer doesn't harm him. Then he kills his pursuer. Before dying, the young pursuer gives a blue stone to the little girl, Kreia Rockwell, and we discover William to have a red stone. The player is sent back to the present day, where Richard solves a puzzle that reveals a painting of a ship, transporting him yet again. This is where we find our main abode for the game. Originally in a Western-style building, the team thought the location an overused setting. They wanted somewhere that wasn't as spacious as they had feared it lacked unity. After considering hospitals, abandoned buildings, and labs, the team landed at the insular location of a ship at sea. They initially told of a more conventional story of a protagonist with companions getting lost inside said ship, but realized exploring the ship alone would have little in environmental variety. This is where the idea to transport the player to various locales originated. To ensure this transition was understood when transported to the ship, the player would be transported from the house to outside the ship to elucidate their arrival in an entirely different space rather than a different room. As you settle in aboard the ship, you encounter a variety of spirits rather than people. An enemy ghost makes itself known early on, and it's shown that turning lights on will be the player's path to safety from them. As this is a prominent recurrence the player needs to keep in mind, the development team thought to include a variety of light switches. Their graphics lead, Sakumi Watanabe, was sporadically told to make various objects for the game, but when it came to light switches was told to make about 10 different types. Understandably, she didn't know how there could be so much variety for ship rooms, so only a select few were notably used. Exploring the ship would make the core premise more apparent. Speaking with friendly ghosts would transport the player to various locations or require the player to acquire various items. After successfully performing these tasks, the spirits can rest and progress in the main story will be had.
I guess there is no need for a drink when you're dead.
At this point, the player will likely understand the game's pace as a slower, yet measured experience as a result of its puzzles. Though this experience can serve as a deterrence for some players, it's also one that can supplement a very important factor for the game for others, being the game's atmosphere. To craft an effective atmosphere, the main environments in the story are essential to cover. Coincidentally, after the team started working on Echo Knight's ship, the 1997 film Titanic would release, reportedly creating a stir within the company, possibly due to the film's popularity, and the team wanted to move away from the commonly portrayed. It would help the team in some ways, however, as, in finding references mostly through model ships and pictures, the Titanic movie helped as a reference for making the ship's engine room, while of course a PS1 game, and entailing the graphics of such. It's clear the team went through multiple efforts to ensure more realistic environments than its contemporaries. The aforementioned effort in lending to realism of interacting with nearly any object may be a part of the game's lead scenario's philosophy. In developing Echo Knight, Toshifumi Nabeshima speaks of freedom as a heavy focus for the game. While the team had been previously praised for their degree of freedom unconstrained by story, the team aimed this time around to allow story and freedom to coexist and harmonize. While many points in the game require solving a main story puzzle to progress, there are also many side stories the player can tackle, and one can typically explore a large amount of any given section of the game. Maybe these are also what he meant by freedom. In typical fashion for FromSoftware delivering on obscure storytelling, some parts of the story are intentionally left out in hopes players would use their imagination to fill in the blanks. In pursuit of supplying a sense of realism, the team thought to create CG cutscenes for buildings when traveling to the past, but decided against it as they thought doing these scenes in real time would help emphasize the game's flow, uninterrupted by videos. That said, FromSoft's early games even at the time were commonly criticized for its graphics, so sticking solely with real-time may have been a contributing factor for this. Likely by far the most criticized aspect of the game, however, would be its lack of combat. Early in development there was some combat, and the team even thought to create more obscure items like signal flares that could be inaccurate if shot at an enemy. They wanted Echo Knight to separate itself more from Kingsfield though, and decided to make it an adventure title with few enemies and omitting combat. Lacking numerous enemies would also allow the team to focus on making more realistic environments, since they could focus more polygons to create environments rather than a breadth of enemies. Though omitting combat would be a central factor for the game's reception, the system to replace it would be intriguing. When encountering dangerous ghosts, the player must turn lights on to make them disappear. Sometimes this can be as simple as finding and turning on a light switch. Other times the player has to solve various puzzles to find ways to turn on said light switches, or find an item tied to said ghosts to make them disappear. Using lights as a form of safety for the player, and deterrence for ghosts, would be an inventive way to allow the game to remain consistent with its slower, older-style adventure gameplay. Reasoning behind this working in-game, however, largely goes unexpressed, and likely comes off as arbitrary. Whether it's due to this lack of cohesion or otherwise, numerous reviews after release would appear to indicate maybe the game should have stuck with tried and true, as opposed to creative, yet uncertain. Though gameplay plays an integral role in a game's atmosphere, audio is also an essential component to creating a mood or tone throughout a game as well. This is where Echo Knight receives most of its praise, consisting of 3 employees for its audio, who simultaneously worked on Shadow Tower. Direction for these members were vague, often given advice with approximations or broad types of atmosphere. The game would have some tonal similarities with Shadow Tower as well, and the team even made a musical track made for one game that ended up being used in the other. A music composer says that while people often praise games through comparisons with movies, he wanted to make the audio more gamey, so they decided to play monster tracks only when a monster's present, and had tracks begin or end based on the player's actions. As can be learned from other games like Silent Hill 2 or Fatal Frame, musical tracks are nice, but silence can also be an effective tool for delivering horror. This is arguably only made more pronounced, however, with a convincing array of sound effects. One of the team members was described as footstep obsessive and pointed out footstep sounds misaligned with the floor. Though sounding simple and easy to get right, can be easily overlooked if not careful. A far more overt example of allowing non-musical sounds to take center stage would be in a young character's laughter. The team had the voice actor do several takes to make sure it sounded just right.
I should never have gotten aboard this ship.
The dialogue in general would be an interesting point of contention. While English dialogue in games in the 90s was often looked at as poor by today's standards,
Oh no!
Echo Knight may very well be consistent with this.
She won't come here anymore.
Despite its performances though, it may also be looked at as off-putting within the game's universe.
It finally opened. I must hurry.
This delivery can turn players off from the game if they perceive the performance to be lacking or subpar. Alternatively, the intuitively strange delivery may also contribute to the game's surreal and dreamlike qualities that are already pervasive in the story.
I should have just stayed by her side. I wonder how she's doing now.
Though gameplay and graphics were rarely considered favorable relative to its contemporaries, Echo Knight managed to craft a uniquely intriguing tone with its strange mechanics and varied environments. When combined with its deliberate choice to omit combat and well-put-together audio design, the game's atmosphere delivers intrigue to the player in ways few games attempted to achieve. Despite the game's attempts to engross players around the world, however, it wouldn't garner much attention. With only approximately half of the team's ideas implemented, partially due to running out of time, Echo Knight would release to little reception, mostly mediocre. GameSpot would take many issues with the game, notably describing the characters as creepy, lacking in polygon count, and disliked spirits often taking the form of wireframes. IGN would give Echo Knight a much more favorable score of 8 out of 10, praising its atmosphere complemented by audio and, likely in response to the GameSpot review, scolded the idea of taking issue with ghosts represented by gray silhouettes. Echo Knight would accumulate at least 2 successors, Echo Knight 2 in 1999 and Echo Knight Beyond in 2004. Both would take their place in their own separate timelines but share common elements. Beyond this, a visual novel for PSP would release in 2005. Near the first game's release in 1998, the lead planner had interesting plans that, whether intentionally doing so or not, FromSoftware would fulfill much later. After alluding to the idea of escalating development from 3D games to VR games, FromSoft would release VR game Deracine in 2018 for PlayStation 4. Hidetaka Miyazaki states they didn't just want to bring back Echo Knight, but thought of their heritage in adventure games, so they started developing a game that turned out to be Deracine. He's attracted by the idea of making games that are often strange, quirky, and unique. After Echo Knight's release, its director spoke of VR and wanting to be able to touch anything and everything with their own hands, like a simulator. While the technology wasn't viable in 1998, this core idea may have been the inspiration for players being able to interact with most of the environments around them. Echo Knight is a fascinating and strangely engaging game. While some may see it as a stepping stone for their future entries, others find it a journey to experience for these strange qualities wrapped up in a unique atmosphere. It may have little going for it, but sometimes, in looking at where a franchise is today, it can be useful to look at the past. And Echo Knight is a past that, whether deserved or not, has largely been forgotten, but is also a fascinating and surreal one. If you've enjoyed this, you may appreciate my documentaries. If you'd like to support my work, Patreon contributions would encourage me to make more. You will gain access to my Discord, early previews, updates, and factoids not presented in these videos. I would also personally love to thank you for donating in future outros. Thanks for watching.